I want to welcome everybody to the fourth panel of this day. For me, you'll forgive me a little bit because I've been up since the beginning, and in my time that was 11:30 last night, and it's now 7 o'clock in the morning. So, so if I seem a little scattered or not quite as coherent as I might normally be, you'll understand. Before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux. I acknowledge and thank the many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples who have taken care of this land, who continue to take care of this land, and have made it possible for so many of us to thrive here. That's a land acknowledgement, and where I am in Canada, it's something that we do, and those of you who were with the earlier panel may have heard Annie Luck do a similar kind of acknowledgement. And I think as we start to talk about leadership for nonviolence, it's important to think about all of the little pieces that we incorporate into our daily actions, into all of our activities that speak to our efforts to transform oppressive relationships. I want to thank you again for being here. This panel is on educational leadership. Educational leadership, many people think about it, but I want to thank the Subjugate team for including us, because quite often when we start talking about action for peace, everybody will say education is important, but educators are forgotten. We are not often included in the discussions while everybody else talks about why education is so important to the process. So I want to thank the team for including us. And I want to say just a word about educational leadership, and then a little bit about how the session will run. So often when we think of educational leadership, we think about the person at the top. Those of you who were with us earlier when we heard the description of the pyramid, we think about maybe the principal at the school or the headmistress at the school. We think about the dean of our faculty. But leadership in education is much more than that. Students exhibit leadership and are leaders. Teachers are leaders. Community members are leaders. We have elected leaders in Canada, for example, for all of the state schools, there are elected school boards. So there are many leaders involved in this process. And I think part of the conversation you're going to hear today is about how that function of leadership can be more nonviolent. I mean, the problem is that we do still run most of our educational institutions on a hierarchical model. So how can we move from that hierarchical model to something that is more nonviolent? And that is what we hope to talk with you about in the next hour and a half. And the way we're going to do this is that we will do initially 3 rounds with our presenters. In the first round, all 5 of us will introduce ourselves. And then in the second round, Fatima, Urvashi, and Luis will answer a question, and that question is, what do you think of when you think of nonviolent leadership? What does it mean to you? And then in the third round, the 3 of them will answer a second question, and that is, what are you doing to promote nonviolent leadership or the development of nonviolent leaders in education? At that point, we'll take a break, and after the break, Salima will respond to what the other 3 have said. Salima will tell you more about herself in a minute, but she is a practicing school leader, and she will speak from her perspective and talk about how the insights that the other three panelists have given us would be something that she could incorporate into her own practice. And then our hope is that we have at that point about 20 minutes or so for the rest of the questions that will come from the group. And I know that this is a group that has lots of questions and wants to interact. So I have no doubt that those questions will follow. So let me start with my introduction. I'm Reva Joshee. I am an associate professor at the University of Toronto, where part of my job, a big part of my job for the last 20 years, has been to teach educational leaders. I am also involved with two Canadian Gandhian organizations, the Mahatma Gandhi Canadian Foundation for World Peace, for which I am currently the co-chair, and a much newer organization called the International Gandhian Institute for Nonviolence and Peace Canada, and I am on the board for that organization. So that is who I am, and I will pass it over to Urvashi for the next introduction.
Well, good evening, everyone. And good morning, Reva. Namaste, adab, and good evening. I am Urvashi Sahni, and I live and work in Lucknow, India. You know, and thank you very much for inviting me on this panel. My journey as a leader spans over 37 years, which is much more than half my life. And it was actually born out of a very violent incident, a personal tragedy in my family, where my own cousin she was 24, she had a 2-year-old baby, and she was burned to death. That was the decade of dowry murders in Delhi, in North India, and she was a victim of that. It shook me to my core, and I started on my feminist journey. And actually started with looking into myself. And then I founded a women's rights organization called Suraksha. And while I was working with students, I chose education as a pathway to actually create non-violent leaders. And Reva, I'm so glad you framed it as in a non-hierarchical way, that when we talk about leaders, we talk about students, we talk about teachers, we talk about community leaders. I lead an organization along with 14 very, very strong leaders. And together we lead an organization of 400 people, 7,900 students. And indirectly, we reach out to thousands and thousands of teachers. And our work, we conceive of education as trying to answer the central question, who am I? And how am I related to the universe and others in it? We have a very, very strong focus on social justice, because we believe that education can be a very powerful transformative force, personal and social, but provided education itself is transformed. And so we have worked for now 34 years to develop curricula and pedagogies to help all our students become leaders of democratic citizenship education. And by democratic citizenship education, I really mean where we know how to realize the core values of equality, fraternity, and liberty, which are the cornerstones of democracy in our own lives, in our communities, in our families, and then in our country. So I'm really so glad to be here, because this is exactly what we do, and I'm very happy to share. And I'm so glad people thought of educators. You were very right, Reva. Everyone talks about education and they think they can do it without us. So thanks for having us on the panel, and I'll rest my case for the time being.
Thank you, Urvashi. And I'll go next to Luis.
Okay, I couldn't find the microphone, sorry. Well, I am Luis Huetra-Charles. I say Charles because it's a Mexican name, a last name. In English, people say Charles, but it's Charles. I am associate professor of multicultural education and critical pedagogies in New Mexico State University, which is located in the southwest border of the United States, that border that joins with Mexico. For that reason, I have had the opportunity to be a border crosser that had been able to interact with educators in Mexico and Latin America. I am also an invited professor at the Institute of Critical Pedagogies that is located in the state of Chihuahua in Mexico. I've been teaching for them for about 8 years as an invited professor, just teaching online classes when I have opportunity to do it. I have been a teacher and teacher educator now for 39 years. I started as a teacher, and now after 20 years, I've been teaching teachers to become agents of social change. I have lived as one of the principles of my professional career that teachers have to serve the communities where they work with humbleness and love. I follow the vision of Paulo Freire all the time. And in this idea, I'm following him in the sense that if teachers are not humble enough to understand that they do not know everything, and students do not ignore everything, they have lost the epistemic curiosity to learn in every interaction they have with their students and with their communities. If teachers do not love what they teach, which is teaching, they don't love the student they have to teach, and they don't love the communities they are working at, I think they cannot continue being teachers. That's my initial participation.
Thank you, Luis. Fatima, let's go to you next.
Greetings, Reva, and greetings to the panelists and greetings to everybody. Coming to you from Herndon in Virginia, but I'm from South Africa. My name is Fatima Hendricks, and I want to take this opportunity to really extend a very, very heartfelt thank you to Jagat and the grand vision of victory to the world. And also show appreciation to the incredible legacy of the Honorable Mahatma Gandhi and the commemoration of the 150 years. It's really been such a privilege to lead up, to be part of this initiative in viewing it from the outside and now being a panelist. And I've been involved within the Muslim community in the area of leadership development, particularly youth leadership development, for about 25 years. And more recently, for the past 5 years, as a co-convener in the area of nonviolence and at Medina Institute Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies, working in particular in terms of leadership development with regards to training, with regard to capacity building in the form of youth summits. Medina Institute Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies, located in South Africa, has global reach in about 10 countries. And I want to take the opportunity to also extend a welcome to one of the founding director, actually, Sheikh Dr. Mohammed bin Yahya al-Ninawi, who's founded Medina Institute, the Educational Institute, the Medina Institute Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies, Planet Mercy, and other organizations, who's dedicated his life to nonviolence and nonviolent activism within the Muslim community. It really stems from a very strong view of Islam as and nonviolence as a foundational principle of Islam, really deeply interwoven into the tapestry of Islam. And from the very, the importance of right at the very beginning with the first revelation of Iqra, which is read or recite, which is the very first word revealed by the Holy Quran, leading to then the many illuminations that follow after that. So thank you so much. I look forward to engaging further, and it's really an honor and privilege to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. And Salima, last but never least.
Good morning here in Canada. For me, it's good morning, but to some, I think it's good evening as well. Firstly, I would like to thank the Jai Jagat movement for continuing this very important dialogue in the face of things that are happening in the world. So thank you so much for including me. I feel truly honored to be invited as a discussant today in today's conference and on this particular panel to hear from all of you and your experiences on nonviolent leadership in various capacities. My name is Salima, and I am a vice principal at a kindergarten to grade 8 school in just the suburbs of the Toronto area in Canada. I've also worked myself in the educational field as an educator in grade schools and in special education for over 20 years. And I've also had the opportunity to work with the Ministry of Ontario as a teacher researcher involved in collaborative work with teachers to engage them in the inquiry process with their students and through student-centered work. My research lies in actually school leadership, and I am a doctoral candidate at the University of Toronto, and I am really excited to be a part of today's discussion. And I just wanted to share really quickly that you know, in the years that, you know, my parents migrated to Canada from Guyana, their focus was on getting an education so you can get a job. And over the years of becoming an educator myself and then a school leader, I have learned that it's much more and much more beyond that. And that educating students is about nurturing leaders into social action and care and kindness for oneself and for others and for nature. And I know that you all share that sentiment with me, which is why we are here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Salima. Okay, so let me move to our next question, which is, what does nonviolent leadership mean to you? And for this round, I'll start with Fatima.
Okay, thank you, Reva. I'd like to start, greetings of peace, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. I'd like to start at the very beginning, really, and I mean right at the very beginning, in presenting a perspective of nonviolence in Islam. The concept of nonviolence can really be traced back to the very first human beings on earth from a Quranic perspective, to Prophet Adam and our mother Hawa or Eve, peace and blessings upon them, and their immediate children, Abel and Cain. And the Quran tells this powerful story about Habil's refusal to retaliate against Qabil. And it's narrated in Surah Ma'idah in verse 29, where Habil actually says to Qabil, which in English may mean, if you are going to extend your hand to kill me, then I will not extend my hand back at you to kill, for I fear the Lord of the worlds. And though superficially we see that this motive might seem religious in the story, in that God accepts the offering of Habil and not Qabil, the underlying human quality that seems to be emerging here is that of envy. And it's really not far removed or dissimilar to the struggles that we face in the world right now, where human ambitions are actually clothed in religious rhetoric. The story really illustrating that violence and its response of nonviolence is actually as old as humanity. And throughout human history, we see that there's been a path of nonviolence from the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, to his honorable grandsons, and notably Imam Hussein bin Ali, peace and blessings be upon him, who has provided a wealth of modeling of nonviolent leadership and the struggle for a more just and loving world. And these examples are really what we begin to emerge in describing as the Madinen school of nonviolence. And I'd like to take the opportunity to just make the connections between the Islamic tradition and the Honorable Mahatma Gandhi. And it was really, it's marvelous in making this connection and thinking through this, because the Honorable Gandhi himself credits Imam Hussein bin Ali, may God be pleased with him, for some of what he learned about nonviolence resistance by saying, I learned from Hussein how to be wronged and how to be a winner. I learned from Hussein how to attain victory while being oppressed. And it said that even the first salt satyagraha is said to be inspired by Imam Hussein's nonviolence resistance to the tyranny of Yazid and the standing at Karbala. And the Honorable Gandhi is said to have studied the history of Islam and Imam Hussein, and was of the opinion that Islam represented not the legacy of the sword, but of the sacrifices of saints like Imam Hussein. And as I worked through the collective works of Mahatma Gandhi, I found some really interesting extracts from his letters. For example, in volume 13, letter 395, the Honorable Gandhi says, Islam did not attain its greatness by the power of the sword, but entirely through the self-immolation of its fakirs or saints. And the marks of a Kshatriya spirit are not cruelty and hard-heartedness. It consists rather in forbearance and readiness to forgive and compassion and all these things that we know, and the strength to stand unshaken and fearless under a shower of bullets. And the true Kshatriya does not kill but receives blow upon himself. And this is where the Honorable Mahatma Gandhi makes reference to Imam Hussein and Hassan as Kshatriyas, whose oppressor was a tyrant. And I find these connections between Islam and the Gandhian school of nonviolence so powerful and really so moving in these invaluable role models it offers in seeking liberty and justice. And what is it that Imam Hussein then is mirroring? He's actually mirroring and modeling the leadership, the nonviolent leadership of his honorable grandfather, the final messenger, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who was described as the walking Quran. And if we look at the Quranic foundation of nonviolence, I mean, one of the verses that's often cited, and I'll repeat it, is really, if anyone saves a life, it would be as if he saved the whole of people. And that's in Surah Al-Ma'idah, which in English may be translated in that way. So the concept of human life being very sacred, and humankind, that we're all the children of Adam and Hawa and Eve as one single collective family, and that one human life has the value or equivalency of the sum total of all of human lives, is actually really profound. And it really speaks to faith systems in general, because faith systems really have come to provide hope, growth, and opportunity to all. None of them are actually there for destruction. It's actually the accursed one, Shaitan, who then makes the claim provides the impetus for destruction and disruption. And what has happened is that there's been a real fundamental disconnection and severing with the meaning and messages of Islam. And we know from the Pew study and other studies that we've done that where violent extremism is located, those violent extremists actually know very little about Islam. And the Islamic kind of methodology that they've taken is one of reductionist, literalist, selective selections of pieces, of extracts, of fractions of Islam misinterpreted out of context. And
Fatima, sorry,
yes?
You can continue on with this maybe in the second question, but
Okay,
we need to move on now.
Thank you so much. All right.
Okay. Did you need to just wrap up what you were saying?
Okay, sure. I think what I'll talk about a little later is just then given this challenge, what we work into in terms of self-transformation and the work that needs to happen. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Fatima. Urvashi.
Thank you, Fatima. We call our organization, my organization, Study Hall Education Foundation. I completely forgot to mention that I was introducing myself. We call it a universe of care, the whole organization. And I want to mention something. You asked me, what does nonviolent leadership mean to me? And as I mentioned, that my whole journey as a leader began in response to violence. So clearly it was being a leader who was against violence. In the first 3 years, against violence against women, and then moving to homes and to society, are extremely abusive, violent places. And not, they're just constructed like that. And so the whole response was to create an educational institution, build a culture that was non-hierarchical, not just in its structure, but also in its conceptual framework, and its curricula, its pedagogy, its treatment of each other and the students. So and to build a universe of care, to have a caring place that was responsive, that was respectful, that was loving. You know, love has become a bad word. I'm so glad you spoke about it, Fatima. And somehow they feel, oh, that's so mushy, and no. So I actually had a teacher, some principal say, look, stop all this love thing. Just teach them. And how can anyone learn from you if they don't feel loved? I just don't understand that. So I think it means creating a culture of care, a culture of love, from which then emanates the culture of non-violence, right? And that results in love, respect, mutual respect. Then secondly, addressing the hierarchies that result in violence, addressing conceptual frameworks, which then translate into violent behaviors. And what does schools do? What does education do? It constructs conceptual frameworks. It gives you habits of mind. And so and when I think of nonviolent leadership, I think of leaders who first of all have worked on their own conceptual structures, who have tried to understand the hierarchical structures they carry in their own heads. And in India, we made it our business to address 4 things: class, caste, communalism, and gender. These are the 4 major hierarchies. So when I think of nonviolent leadership, I think of a self-aware leadership that is loving, respectful, caring. And it's only when you are self-aware and self-critical and critical of your own structures, critical of your own religion, right? And critical of all the hierarchies that you carry with you and that you practice consciously or unconsciously, to look at your own blind spots, and most importantly, to be self-aware, and then to act from that awareness, to build greater awareness. It has been my experience as a leader that we have violent societies, we have hierarchical structures, because no one has ever tried to work on the conceptual structures that we carry. That it is all in the mind. Everyone talks about mindsets, but nobody is addressing them. And schools and education is a very, very powerful, a very fertile ground. It's a space of radical possibilities. That's Bell Hooks' words, not mine. And a space. And it can be a very loving space where Freire is my hero, Luis. I'm so honored to be on the same panel with you. And so we have I will talk about it in the next round, about the strategies we use, but just to give you a hint that we practice critical pedagogy and have been doing that. Reva has been witness to that. And to honor the previous panel, we practice transformative drama very, very intensively and extensively on our work. And we look at nonviolent leadership in a non-hierarchical way, which means creating non-violent people. And then they go out to be leaders, the present and the future. And in fact, intentionally creating non-violent leaders through our curricula, through our pedagogies. I'm going to stop there, Reva, before you tell me my time is up. And we'll come to address the next round, save everything else for the next round.
Thank you so much, Urvashi. Luis, nonviolent leadership, what does that mean to you?
Okay, thank you. Well, I will speak from my context as being a teacher educator for many years now. And I try always to prepare teachers, educational and curricular leaders in their school and communities. In that sense, I consider that nonviolent leadership must be understood as a personal and political process that teachers must embrace when they experience situation of oppression and exclusion in the communities where they are working at. They have to be able to work in their classroom and in their communities to support people in achieving conscientization as a process of self-liberation for understanding the oppressive conditions that are limiting themselves to become more, as Freire said, to be more human, to become more human. In that way, I consider that critical pedagogues must help to uncover the reality that has been sweetened to make it look better, to misguide people and communities to believe, as Margaret Thatcher mentioned, I think 40 years ago, that there is no alternative. That was incredible when she said that. When teachers and people in the community liberate themselves, they will be able to break the chains of control that have made them to accept the limiting reality as something that should be taken for granted, or as the normalized way things are. They have to stop believing that that way is the only way society works, as part of the process to break down the silent violence that groups in power have created to subjugate them. And I said silent because that's kind of a process of socialization that every citizen, and including the teacher themselves, have been subjected to through institutions, through the families, through all the values that the system has embedded in the process. But that system, that socialization had made them obedient servants of the system. People have to name that reality as oppressive, denounce it publicly, and announce a more socially just and equitable society. I said announce because it's not yet, but can be built, can be constructed. In that process of liberation, teachers and people must create alliances and solidarity to work toward the construction of the better society that they are announcing. They must be strategic in planning action to protest and defy the oppressive conditions and actions that those groups in power, and I'm putting here government and allies they have organized against them. However, teachers have to realize that violent actions are not the solution, because that is what the group in power wants. In that way, we enter into the fight they want to fight, because they have the armament, they have the force, and they have the trained people to attack and kill. And they are not going to hesitate to use them, because in their logic is the law and order, as our president has been saying, perspective that keeps society safe. We were seeing this happening, for example, in these times, in these past weeks, when some people have infiltrated the Black Lives Matter protests that have arose in the United States, and I think around the world too. Those infiltrated people smash windows of some business to justify that the police and the National Guard attack the peaceful protesters that were denouncing the systemic racism that is still prevails in our society, in the United States society. Teachers, nonviolent leadership must align with the basic principles of Jagat movement. And I'm glad that I had this opportunity, because I am learning a lot from this group of colleagues, and also from the information available in the webpage, on the webpage. For example, teacher nonviolent leadership must be focused to eradicate poverty, stop any kind of discrimination, and for also trying to stop the extermination of the nature, the mother nature, but also to help students and peoples in the community to achieve conscientization in order to act to transform the conditions that are limiting them to live with dignity in this society.
Okay.
That would
All
be
right.
my participation, Reva.
Okay, thank you so much, Luis. You're going to come back very quickly now, but just before you do that, I want to just bring people's attention to a few things out of what all three of you have said that really resonate with me. The need to be in touch with our spiritual selves and to question those selves, to look for within ourselves an understanding of the structures as they operate within us, to uncover those, to deal with them, not just within ourselves, but publicly. And above all else, to be loving and caring and to act for change. I think those are immense places to start as we think about this notion of nonviolent leadership. So the next question then, and Luis will just pick up with you, is what are you doing, and you've started this conversation already, or what have you done to support the development of nonviolent leaders in the work that you are doing? And it would be great to hear about both the work in the United States and in Mexico.
Okay, my micro is open. Well, I have assumed my commitment to critical pedagogies as a life philosophy, not as a teaching method with the steps that need to be applied to teach in my classroom. I have tried to engage all my student pre-service and in-service teachers to embrace that commitment as well. And I do this in every space that I have the opportunity to interact, being here in my classes in the United States, being my interaction, my classes, my workshop, my conferences in Mexico or in Latin America, which I had also the opportunity to be in different countries too. My teaching has always aimed to help teachers achieve certain level of conscientization in order to transform into something better the ugly, well, Paulo Freire mentioned in that way, the ugly and violent society in which we live. I have been doing that in all my classes, conferences, and workshops. I follow one idea that one of my colleagues that unfortunately passed away some years ago, Joe Kinchelo, told me in one conference that we shared. He said, if you want to be a critical pedagogue, you need to be that 24/7. And he's totally right. He was correct in that asseveration, and I follow that too. I have worked with teachers and students, mainly in Mexico and in the US. I am a border crosser that live the process of crossing borders as a metaphor to become a living testimony that realities may be changed. The reality that I have here could be a little bit different than the reality that I have in Mexico. And the Mexico is a different reality that we have here. And I try to be, make a balance between the two places that I'm usually working with them. Because my emphasis is to show them that realities may be changed, that oppressive economic and social conditions are socially constructed to benefit specific groups that ambition power and profit. Profit over people, as Noam Chomsky mentioned at the end of the 20th century in one of his beautiful books that he has written. I have delivered a message of hope as well. However, working in Mexico, where daily living conditions are sometimes horrifying, has made me to embrace hope strongly, because sometimes I'm kind of losing it too. If you live under conditions where the system, governments and allies, and the drug cartels, lords, do not hesitate to kill or just disappear people that protest or resist the inhuman and heartless strategies they use to obtain more profit, you really have to be willing to sacrifice yourself on behalf of the betterment of the living condition of other people. And when I was preparing this participation, I was thinking on the reading of Gandhi, the level that he puts self-sacrifice as an important part of achieving universal truth. That's incredible because I saw the connection in the work that I'm doing with conscientization with teachers in Mexico and the United States. Engaging teachers and educators to embrace a nonviolent leadership is complicated, no doubt about it, because most of the time, the self-sacrifice it requires from them, from the teacher, from the participants, is not easily accepted. It needs to be seen, however, as an act of love. That is why I have to be a living testimony for them. I have to demonstrate that act of love, but not as a simple performance in front of our audience, but as a praxis with them, and sometimes with them in the protest too. In Chihuahua, I have a lot of examples, experiences when the teachers are marching and protesting, and I've been able to participate with them, sharing the same street and the same yelling and movement and things like that. I have been challenging teachers and educators to move out of the comfort zone, to put themselves in the shoes of the oppressed and marginalized people. Many teachers I have interacted with have been also domesticated because they were socialized into the logic of the system. That is why many times teachers do not support or speak against acts of nonviolent protest that interrupt their daily activities or that confront their own way of seeing that domesticated reality. And we have seen that in the last movements, for example, in Mexico, when women, feminists are protesting about the number of violence report that have happened in this time of the pandemic. Even at home, when they have isolated themselves as family, the calling to 911 has increased 80%, if I can say like that, just with violence against women. And women protest, and even teachers say, oh, they should be more tranquil, kind of being into themselves and blah, blah, blah. They don't like people disrupting the life they are, the daily activity they do. I have taught them how education and pedagogy are political acts. Education and pedagogy have been used to continue domesticating people into the logic of this savage and ravenous capitalist system that made the marginalized people to feel disposable tools of the system, like if they were disposable human beings.
Okay,
I have
Luis,
tried.
Sorry, I think we'll have an opportunity to pick up on this because I see questions coming from people around this. So we'll move to Fatima now. And the same question to you, Fatima. What have you done, are you doing to support the development of nonviolent leaders?
All right, thank you so much, Reva. I just need a few seconds to just pull up my little presentation. I hope everybody can see this. Okay, that's great. So through the Medina Institute Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies, we've really been looking at capacity building and enablement in terms of nonviolence and peace. And this is built on really the principle of reform, a tajdeed, renewal, and islah, to repair. There's been a severing of knowledges through our tradition, which has really resulted in fracturing of a knowledge base. And that fracturing of the knowledge base has we've seen in the manifestations of some of the challenges that we face in our communities. And so the whole emphasis of Medina Institute and this Medina Institute Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies is to return to the Quran and return to the prophetic Sunnah, the practices of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And so the answer is not less religion, but more religion. And so that's certainly what we've been looking at. And just like Louise has stated, through this lens of critical pedagogy is really engaging in the critique and this critical pedagogy as an act of love, where nonviolence is an adjective and peace is an active, the pursuit of peace is an active pursuit. And then we also have the community-based programming where, you know, there's this proliferation of the theme of love, as Urvashi was talking about, was really around how we take the theme of love on which nonviolence and peace is built and make that lived experiences. And one of the flagship books has been by Sheikh Mohammed bin Yahya al-Linawi, where there's been a global rollout of the Book of Love. And the spiritual irrigation in the community around working up in terms of self-transformation, and the self-transformation space has been is one that we really focus on. Without the self-transformations and this conversion, this work in terms of changing thought patterns and changing that results in this change of conscious will, that can then sever, you know, maladaptive responses in terms of violence, we won't make much progress. So there's deep emphasis on love. The other area that we've been working on is leadership camps, so the residential training camps where there's spiritual training and the concept of what we call tarbiyah, and the making of voices, not giving of voices, because we don't give voices to people, but the making of voices together. And this notion of suhba, sorry, I put subha, it's actually suhba, and the relationships with self, others, and the earth. Another area has been, for 5 years now, this will be our 5th year, we took up the call of the United Nations for the Orange the World Youth Summit, Orange the World Activism during the 16 days of activism. And Medina Institute has for the past 5 years hosted the Orange the World Youth Summit. And we've done participatory group work, and really, because of our deep apartheid history, really worked very hard on bringing high school students from across this cross-section of Cape Town in all its fragmentation together, and mobilizing around the 16 days of activism, activating youth networks. It's a youth lab using performative theater, so it was so beautiful to see the previous session on performative theater. And the other area is not separate to this, which is really about the spiritual irrigation, helping, using the spiritual skills that we have within Islam to activate spiritual strength and resiliency. So for example, this ladies' dhikr, or the majlis, the gathering of women's circles of remembrance, and focusing them on, like Orange the World, and issues around gender-based violence, and capacitating that from a spiritual point of view. And so these activities are really, this notion of self-transformation is deeply rooted within the Quran, which talks about God will not change the condition of the people until we change what is in ourselves. Another area is about building resiliencies and making sense of tragedies that have hit the Muslim community. And they're not just internally in terms of the tragedies that have hit us, but also in terms of reaching out to our fellow humanity and supporting all of the instances of violent extremism and terrorism that have been showered on peoples around the world. And so saying together in a unified voice how we support each other. And then we've also used the concept of making of voices and really getting creative. We've had a social good youth summit in Kailicha, showcasing the good that youth do. So this notion of positive youth development and really entrepreneurial, ecological contributions. We've had art galleries, the art of nonviolence, where artists have done photographic exhibitions. We also work in the interfaith space around interfaith engagement and this enablement of skills and tools and how to talk and how to engage and how to dialogue. And this work is also, so Medina Institute has a global presence, and I'm really just mentioning some of the work that we've been doing in South Africa. But this has been a decades long. And so some people would have us believe that, nonviolence is new to Islam, and nonviolence is a new concept. And we have, for thousands, this has been over 1,000 years where we've been working in this space. And unfortunately, the hate speaks louder than the love, and the violence speaks louder than the nonviolence. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to share this. I really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fatima. And Urvashi, we will turn to you now. You're muted. Urvashi, you're muted, Urvashi.
Sorry about that. Well, thank you, Louise, Fatima, for your comments, and Reva for the opportunity. So, let's speak in the context of school education. We've also started a college very recently, but mainly school education, which by, first of all, its own structure is very inclusive. We reach out to rural children, we reach out to urban children, we reach out to the rich, the poor, specially abled, and young men, teachers, community folks, the whole universe. So I think the first way we deal with it is by being inclusive and deconstructing barriers, boundaries, and hierarchies. So that is by action, by the structure of it. That is one. The second thing we do, that we have really tried to reframe and redefine the goal of education. Because if you look at school education and you look at curricula, it's very much part of very cognitive, very part of decontextualized academic skills, giving exams, getting into good colleges, and then having a career, and that is all. We have made it part of our core curriculum. Critical pedagogy is what we use, and we have critical dialogue intentionally all the way from class 1 up to class 12 and college in our core curriculum. We train our teachers intentionally, as I mentioned earlier, through critical pedagogy. One, to be self-aware and break and build non-violent, non-hierarchical, equal conceptual structures, and then help students build the same. Right? And how do we do it? We addressed gender first of all, as I told you, because my own journey started, and being a woman in India, and Fatima, you will probably resonate, and so will many other women all over the world. The kind of gender-based violence in India, 1 rape every 15 minutes. They are unsafe in the womb, high rates of sex-selective female abortion, okay? And at home, on the streets. So we address that first of all. And what do we do? Through critical pedagogy, we form culture circles, Louis, it will all resonate, where we have critical dialogues, where they learn to talk about their own reality, name them in order to transform. And we try to build in them, first of all, an awareness that they are equal persons deserving respect, that the world is their home like anybody else's, because the oppressed often feel homeless, right? And that they have the right to protest against violence. And here I want to invoke the Bhagavad Gita and Mahatma Gandhi, where I think he's the one who taught us that you must protest against discrimination, against violence. Whereas it is a sin to perpetuate violence, it is an equal sin to tolerate violence, whether against yourself or your fellow being. Right? So we teach our students, we build a voice. They must understand 3 things. We build a feminist consciousness. 1, that it is wrong. 2, that it is historically constructed, not natural, not God-given, and it can be changed. And to imagine a way of doing that. We teach our boys, by the way, that patriarchy is not their fault, but it gives them unearned privilege, and it is very violent to their mothers, their daughters, their sisters, all the women they love, right? And that it makes them into these violent monsters who they don't want to be. Right? So we try to build these habits of equality, habits of peace in the mind right from childhood, with the understanding that just as all these non-violent habits are engendered because of social structures, because of families, similarly you can deconstruct them and you can build them. We do that. We use drama very extensively, because that's a place where you can build, where you can boys learn to see, to act out, how to understand where the shoe pinches. Girls perform actions of how they feel when they are married off early, when domestic violence, when they're victim to domestic violence in front of their parents, so that the parents can empathize and learn from them. They have done dramas about paternal alcoholism, paternal violence, and what that feels like. So we use, and it's a safe place with no violent consequences, where they can express their indignation, express their pain, and learn to construct a more positive, non-violent kind of world that they would like. And it has been very effective. Then we have just this, we use large-scale campaigns. Louise, you were speaking about that, where our teachers, students, members of community, they march. And there were, last year we had 1.1 million people marching. We call it India's Daughters Campaign in villages. And it is led by teachers and students. They get signature campaigns. They talk to parents. They argue with them against child marriage, against violence against. And this year, our campaign, and I invite all of you to please join. It says that India's sons of India, boys and men, step up. What will you do? How will you change to make India safe for her daughters? Your sisters, your mothers, you know, they are yours. These women, they are yours. Then we work against caste. And somebody asked, they had a question in the chat box, that in these days of lockdown, how are you? How is the critical pedagogy functioning? Oh, it's functioning. Just today, I was in a 2.5-hour session of our teachers, our principals, our students, our alum and parents on caste discrimination. And how do you change? How do you annihilate caste? And we've been reading Ambedkar's article on the annihilation of caste and the dialogue with Mahatma Gandhi on that. So the point that I'm trying to make is that it has to, and it has been an ongoing process, and I'm telling you, it's been 34 years. I know it will not happen in my lifetime, but I'm hoping it will happen in the lifetime of my children, my grandchildren, and all the students that we work. And already I see the change. Already I see the change in the lives of our girls and our boys. They are learning to become more equal. They are learning to fight the forces of violence. Right? And so I think what I'm saying is that the strategy has to be a multi-pronged, and all this in a culture of care and love. So with boys particularly, you know, they're always facing violence. And they are taught to be violent as though that is an important part of their manhood. That if they are not violent, then they are not men. So we are trying to deconstruct that toxic masculinity. Then this culture of rape. We are trying to deconstruct the sexuality, the toxic sexual culture that we have in our society. Most importantly, we are trying to get our students and our teachers. And you know, we work just as hard and use the same strategies with all our leaders and teachers. Just like this, like we're doing right now, right? That understand your constitution. We have one of the finest constitutions in the world. But there was never, and you know, some great policies, but there was never a policy that you must educate people about these policies. And so that is what we are translating. And we think this is important educational work. It is not extracurricular. It is not an after-school program. It is at the heart and the core of our educational curriculum. Then all our leaders, all our teachers, we insist that these are the core values that this organization stands for. And so we must try to understand it. And actually, these are the core values that democracy stands for. So it is your constitutional duty. It is your duty as a member of Study Hall Educational Foundation, the family, to understand, to make them part of your lives, and then to act from that core. And I have seen the remarkable difference it has made. And during COVID, it really shone through. It really, online, they also addressed hunger. They addressed domestic violence. They made it their business to go into communities and work with them and see, what did you need? What do you need? Was their first response. What are you afraid of? What can we do for you? Tell us what we can do. And together, how.
Okay. So Urvashi, I think you're cutting out a little bit, and I think this might be actually a good time for us to take a bit of a break and yeah, so we'll take a bit of a break now, and we'll come back. We have a number of questions already, and there are more, I'm sure, that will come over the break. And when we come back from the break, Salima will kind of speak to what all of you have said from the perspective of a leader who is really just beginning her journey in thinking about these kinds of ideas. So I'll turn it over to Janmajai.
Thank you. I'll make this very fast. We have a, well, a podcast for slow piece, actually. A small promo of 2 minutes that we'd like to start with. And it will be followed by a video on the Jai Jagat March's experiences when they were traveling around in Armenia with a small background in India. So we hope you enjoy. It's a 7-minute break. Feel free to, if you need to have any water, take a walk, anything. So we'll see you.
At this time, particularly when the whole world is in such turmoil, I feel that it is so much needed. The rays of hope are so much needed, and when somebody talks from their heart, people really listen.
I've done kind of semi-active volunteering for probably good 13 years or so. But I always felt like I was just by myself. And so the more that I get into it, the more I see that there are also other people in similar situations that have actually been doing all kinds of wonderful work. Doing a podcast, talking to people, sharing stories could be all part of it. And I think no matter how small it seems, I'm hoping that the podcast could actually bring all the small stories together and give people a sense of that they're belonging to something bigger.
I am excited to kind of connect with people doing nonviolence work in lots of different fields and lots of different places as a way of showing that we stand together, as a way of witnessing people who are doing that work and saying, we see you and we believe in you and you have support here. But also to connect to a listener and, show them that there's proof that good is being done.
And I somehow feel that while we will do this, we will find similar souls in different places, and maybe we connect them to each other.
Speaking Our Piece is a podcast that brings you stories of individuals and communities from all over the world, united by one concept, that if we want justice and peace, we must each take nonviolent action. Join us in conversations with scholars, educators, and activists on the ground who have given their lives to this cause. If you would like to contact the podcast, please email us at speakingourpiece@gmail.com. And that's peace as in PEACE.
Thank you. And now for a quick look at Jai Jagat's experience in Armenia through a small music video.
सबके हित के वास्ते अपना सुख विसारे जा सबके हित के वास्ते अपना सुख विसारे जा जय जगत जय जगत जय जगत पुकारे जा जय जगत जय जगत जय जगत पुकारे जा सबके हित के वास्ते अपना सुख विसारे जा
But in Armenian way, we should say
Thank you. Handing over back to Reva Ben, and congratulations on the launch of the podcast.
Thank you so much, Janmajay. Let me just say a word about the podcast before I turn it over to Salima. There's a small group of us that have been working on this podcast called Speaking Our Piece, and it has not officially launched yet, but that URL that was on the screen while you were listening to the teaser will give you the very first of the podcasts. You'll get a sneak preview, as it were. If you go to that site, you can hear the first of the podcasts. It will probably, we haven't got a firm date for it, but we will probably launch the podcast in August sometime. We are interviewing marchers from the Jai Jagat. We are interviewing activists who've been involved in this work for a long time, and we're interviewing activists who are relatively new to the work. It's going to be a fantastic set of interviews. I apologize in advance for this first one if you go listen to it, because it's me. So with that, I will turn it to Salima.
Thank you. Wow, each of you have spoke so passionately about the work you do in service of others and in building nonviolent leadership capacities in people to affect change and social action. For myself as a school vice principal, I am inspired by your unwavering commitment and ability to engage with your staff, your students, your community, and inspired myself in how I'm going to do that. So from listening to the three of you speak, I've kind of got to a few sort of epiphanies. One is the importance of engaging in critical dialogue with all those involved, you know, asking those deep questions about issues that occur core to the current context of the lives of our students. Urvashi, you had mentioned asking what is it that you need, and how important that is to ask and listen, and also from a space of democratic schooling. The other thing I learned from Fatima was the piece about understanding that the conditions that we live from and the responses to it from an Islamic perspective is at the heart of humanity, and how we respond to nonviolence, to violence, should be through nonviolence and from a place of love and care. And I also, you know, from Louis, this concept of conscientization, I don't even think I'm saying it properly. You say it so beautifully, actually. And you know that it begins with critical pedagogy and Freire's work around the questions of justice and democracy, and that dialectical between individual accountability and social responsibility. And how are we having those conversations? And, you know, I really liked this idea that critical pedagogy is in fact an act of love, and peace is an active pursuant. So, you know, as a vice principal and as a school leader, you know, how am I engaging at all levels this idea of critical discourse and this ability to have a conversation with everyone about what matters to them, about what's happening in their lives, and then globally, what is happening in the world and how we are all interconnected. So that was one around the engaging in critical dialogue. The other piece is building relationships. That was a very big thing that stood out for me in listening to all three of you, and that active listening and communicating and willing to be reflective of one's own leadership decisions as well. And that, again, that interconnectivity and collaborative and mutual work. And that the work is a process and ongoing. You've all talked about always continuing in that dialogue, that's almost struggle dialogue, and that it has to continue, it has to keep moving. And how do you build that into, you know, a school setting where you have time constraints and concerns with, you know, getting through the curriculum from educators, and how do you ensure that you're listening and actively understanding what the perspective is of the educators in the building, the community members, the students, the office staff, the custodial staff, and where they're all coming, because they all are contributing to this culture of space, this culture of love and care within the school and concern for everyone. So I really loved that piece, Urvashi, when you talked about the universal care. And I'd actually really love to hear more about that as well. And the culture of love. And one of the things in building relationships that I took from Louise was when he was talking about how violent actions, you know, the answer to that in many spaces in education is some sort of authoritative discipline. And you mentioned, because, you know, this is what society wants, but, you know, this is not restorative or a learning process for the students or for those involved when, you know, something violent does happen. And as a leader in a school, it's navigating those conversations, those spaces, to understand that the process when something violent happens needs to be a non-violent action towards all involved. And I really like that piece. you know, being present, I think, is important in building relationships to everyone's lives, to the daily lives of those that are around you, and understanding that, and Fatima, you spoke about this in Urvashi, around making sure that there's space for making voices or building voices, Urvashi, you said, and not that you're giving voice. I really, really like that. That really resonated with me because, you know, that is a term that's used, like, oh, you need to give voice and allow them to share and speak, but we're not giving them the opportunity to feel safe and trusted, and that this is a culture of love and care, so that they can find that space to build their voice, to develop their voice, to make their voice. And I think that that is another piece that I'd like to talk a bit more, you know, if we can. The other thing is, so critical dialogue, building relationships is, and I'm not sure how to sort of say it, but sort of almost like live. So living, Luis, you talked about this, living in praxis or transformative, and having the courage and the spirituality to continue with this work, you know. So I think bringing that piece in, you know, was interesting, was a big piece, like for me, because I think that's the space where I'm at in my leadership journey, is that transformative piece where I am now starting to understand what I need to do in order to be a listener, in order to be a learner, in order to engage others in this type of dialogue, and having that lived mindset and living it, Luis said, 24/7. Living it 24/7, I think, and that it really is a self-sacrifice to constantly and persistently and reflective and being iterative in the process from a place of community and betterment for all, and that transformative process, you know, in this space of like engaging in the philosophies of critical pedagogy from fear, and Gandhiji's philosophies of ahimsa and satya in practice, and Islamic, you know, philosophies around, you know, nonviolence being, you know, at the heart of humanity, and that, you know, that piece that you shared, Fatima, about how one human life is the sum of the total of all lives. You know, that piece as well.
Salima, I'm sorry, we've only got about 12 minutes left, and
sure.
I wonder if we could just, there's a couple of questions. I think some of the things, actually, thank you, Urvashi, you've been writing back answers to people, so that's been lovely. But there are two things, and I think that all four of you could probably address them in some kind of way, as long as we do it quickly. One is, how do you bridge differences between people who are very divided? You know, everybody's talked about dialogue. How do you bridge those differences between people who are very divided, who really see themselves on opposite sides of a conflict? And the other question is really a kind of larger one around gender equity. I think we've touched on several pieces of it, but one of the particular questions was, how do you ensure that voices of women are heard, especially when they are the minority in a particular group? So I'll open that up to whoever wants to start, and maybe just kind of take whichever. Urvashi, do you want to start? You need to unmute.
Thank you, Salima, for your comments. I'm going to just quickly respond to your universe of care. You asked, you wanted to say me to say more. I will do that in a minute. But before that, I just want to respond to Reva, the question that has come from the audience about how do you get people from opposite sides to talk to each other. And you know, in our work with gender and even our work with caste, we have encountered this, that they live in different There's a different mental and emotional universe that both people inhabit, right? And the important thing is to understand each other. So I remember, and Reva, you were there when we did this whole drama, the process drama on terrorism, actually, where I got these children to sit in a group and pretend that they were terrorists and they were going to do this tomorrow. And the night before the act, they're sitting at home and having dinner with their family. What is the mother saying? Act it up. What are you feeling? Think about it. What are your thoughts? What are your feelings? You're going to do this awful thing tomorrow. And you're going to die too. So really, they got around the room and they were beginning to talk about feelings, and they were able to understand each other's perspective and even understand the mindset of the terrorist and where that was coming from. So it takes time. In my trainings of gender, where I have to men, as well. It's a very hard, it takes a lot, their mothers, their daughters, their sisters, that, you know, this is really your problem. It's not the opposite side. I think trying to build an understanding that it's not, you're not on the opposite side, actually, you're on the same side. And it helps, it's a win-win for both of you. And just today we were talking about caste, and there was Varnas on the group, and there were Dalits, everybody. And the Dalits were emboldened to tell people how they felt and what it was doing and how they had pushed back. And the Savarnas, it was helping them reduce some of their caste blindness, to build a sense of empathy. So I think empathy is the answer.
Urvashi? I think we're sort of losing you again, and so maybe what we'll do is we'll open it to Luis. I think he wanted to say something on this.
Well, thank you. I think the two questions, or the two aspects of the questions, are very important. In my case, because I'm working with adults most of the time, it has been so complicated. I'm teaching here in the United States, and I'm teaching in Chihuahua, in Mexico, but in Chihuahua it's different because it's a school that is directed to teach critical pedagogy. But here in the United States, it's not exactly a degree on critical pedagogy. It's just a general teacher education program. And I've been working with a person that came out of the military, person that are coming from a white supremacist background. And even at the moment that I start the class and they listening to my way of speaking English, which is not the formal English they used to hear, the conflict starts from the very beginning. But something that I have done through the years is trying to be patient for one part, not taking the aggression as a personal issue against me. I need to understand that they have been socialized in specific ways. And then in the dialogue, and I try to always to maintain a critical dialogue with them, trying to make them to reflect on what they said and to listen to the different experiences that I have seen, that the other colleagues are sharing in the class. But it's a hard process when they are not willing to engage in a conversation. But in my class, I follow what Freire said. I'm an authority, but not authoritarian. And Freire said, you as authority, you are responsible for the learning of them, the student that you have. So I assume my authority and challenge them directly when they are not engaging or they are trying to avoid to work with a specific group of Hispanic, brown people, things like that, and always challenge them in that way. The only case that I have not been able to dealing with was with one student that took me to the deans, for example, because I was pushing her to work with people that she didn't want to work. Well, it was resolved positively, fortunately, but even at that extreme, I had to understand that she was socialized in that way. It's an ideology and it's very pervasive. So when you are in the different side of the coin, if I can say it in that way, for me, just hope, maintaining critical dialogue, and not being that kind of humbleness, not taking the things personally from one person, because he or she is the result of a socializing process. In my classes, for example, when we engage in critical dialogue, I have more women than men in my classes all the time. But even in the classes, when I have 2-3 men sharing with 15 women the same space, when I notice that there is a kind of offensive, discriminatory language use, I stop it and confront it all the time. And I am doing that in my own praxis. That is why I mentioned that we need to be 24/7, as Joe Kinchelo told me a long time ago in 2006, I think, because even in my own way, I need to live it and understand that I'm not exactly, I was educated as a machista in my family, from a patriarchal system, and I'm dealing with that every single day of my life. I need to continue doing that. Because, for example, even in my heart, in
Luis,
the root part of my heart,
yeah. I'm sorry. I know we've only got 3 minutes left, and I want to make sure that Fatima gets an opportunity to respond as well. But thank you so much. Thank you for that. Fatima.
Thank you, Reva. I'd like to just build on what Urvashi and Louise have spoken about, and this notion of this intergroup dialoguing, and that's something that I've been working at in the Center for Diversity and Inclusion, the School of Education at American University, and really intentionally getting opposing groups together and engaging in intergroup dialoguing for undergraduate students. And we've been working in the area of whiteness, immigration and nationality, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and using a very intentional learning activities. And as an occupational therapist, I've brought in aspects of like using the creative arts. So things like drama and the use of methods like tableau and these non-verbal kind of methods as well. And the use of silences in the processes for reflection. And those have all been very, very useful. So I think the space of intergroup dialoguing is so rich and so and has so many different opportunities in different contexts to manifest itself in different ways too, and not just as this very rigid, one way of doing things. So I think intergroup dialoguing holds much potential. So thank you so much for that.
Oh, and I just want to say that if Fatima will allow me to share this information, she has a wonderful manual that she has created on intergroup dialogue, and I'm sure that if you got in touch with her, that she would be happy to share it with you. It's absolutely fantastic. It's a great tool. I know we're at 1 minute to time, but Salima, I think you can have 2 minutes if you want to just wrap up or respond in some kind of way.
Oh, thank you. I think I'll just sort of wrap up and say that, what I've gathered is that there's such a sense of hope, in all of this, in the Jai Jagat movement, and in really being intentional with how we pursue peace and engaging in developing nonviolent educational leaders, and that critical dialogue, building relationships, embodying a sense of hope and transformative process are all key to this process. So thank you so much. I have learned so much from listening to the three of you, and I actually do hope to continue this dialogue, outside of this space with each of you. I feel truly honored. Thank you so much.
I think that's a better thank you than I could have given, but what an amazing panel this has been. And I thank each and every one of you for being part of it. And Salima in particular, since you didn't thank yourself, I'm going to thank you because I think you really did such a wonderful job of kind of pulling out some of the key elements of everybody's talk and bringing it together in a place of practice. So